Zora moved through the vast hallways of the academy, feeling a nervous buzz deep in her core. It was her first day in gym class, and she wasn't sure what to expect. The students here came from all over the galaxy, all sorts of strange and bizarre species, but they all shared one thing in common. They were all incredibly strong in their own unique ways. Zora herself was a vorthoid, an aquatic species whose strength lay in the fluidity of her movements and her ability to adapt to environments others would find hostile. But today she wasn't so sure she'd be able to keep up. It wasn't that she didn't believe in herself, it was that there were rumors swirling around the academy that a new student would be joining their class. A Deathworlder. She had heard the stories about them, the terrifying tales of their strength and fearlessness, and though she had never seen one in person, Zora knew enough to understand that a Deathworlder could make even the strongest of beings feel weak and insignificant. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face something like that. She had heard that Deathworlders came from planets so hostile that only the strongest and most dangerous of creatures survived there. They were said to be relentless, unstoppable warriors whose mere presence could cause fear in even the most seasoned of fighters. No one knew much about them. The stories were vague and often conflicting. Some said Deathworlders had a terrifying natural ability to fight. Others claimed they could adapt to any environment and to survive anything that was thrown at them. Zora's mind raced with questions as she arrived at the gym doors. She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath and swimming up to the large metal entrance, her webbed feet making soft taps against the smooth floor of the academy. The gym was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was vast and open with synthetic gravity fields that allowed students to simulate the conditions of different planets, no matter their natural environment. The massive space was designed to push the students to their limits and prepare them for the challenges of the universe. Zora pushed the door open, feeling the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her as she entered the gym. There were already other students gathered inside. They were all in their athletic uniforms, chatting and stretching. Some of the younger students were whispering excitedly to each other, while others seemed lost in their own world. But when Zora's eyes scanned the room, she froze in place. A chill ran down her spine as she saw the figure standing at the far end of the gym. The new student, the Deathworlder. He stood there confidently, though there was an odd sense of calm about him. He was smaller than she had expected, but there was something unsettling in the way he carried himself. His body seemed to radiate an energy that Zora couldn't quite explain. He wasn't like any of the students she had ever seen before. His skin was a strange pale beige with red undertones. It seemed to glow slightly in the artificial light, and his movements, though slow and deliberate, were sharp and precise. He didn't look like a warrior or a fighter, but there was something about him that made her feel small and insignificant. It was as though everything around him faded into the background and he became the center of attention. No one else seemed to know what to make of him. Either the students were staring at him in silence, murmuring to one another, but no one approached. No one dared to ask questions. Instead, they all simply observed the new arrival from a safe distance. Zora felt her heart race as she swam closer to the group, her eyes locked on the Deathworlder's face. Though he had not yet spoken, he was looking directly at her, and in that moment she felt as though he could see straight through her. His eyes were dark and intense, the kind of gaze that made her feel exposed. It was as though he could read her thoughts and knew exactly what she was thinking. The gym door slid shut behind her with a soft hiss, and Professor Sillar, a tall and graceful Irith, stepped forward to greet the new student. "You must be the new student," she said, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "Welcome to gym class." The Deathworlder said nothing at first. His lips curled into a small grin, and his body shifted slightly as though ready to move at any moment. He took a step forward and the room seemed to hold its breath. "I'm what you call human," he said, his voice rough but clear, his accent unfamiliar and harsh. "Name's Jason." Zora felt her pulse quicken as Jason's words hung in the air. They were simple enough, but the way he spoke made her feel even more unsettled. He didn't seem scared or nervous or even unsure. He spoke with an air of confidence that made Zora feel small and insignificant. She glanced around and saw that the OR students were equally unsure of how to respond. Some of them shifted nervously, Others exchanged glances, but no one spoke for a long moment. Professor Silar hesitated as though trying to find the right words. "Very well, Jason," she said finally. "Welcome to the Academy. Let's begin today's session." With a small nod, Jason stepped forward, and Zorro watched in silence as the rest of the students began to gather into their designated areas. The first exercise was simple enough. It was a race across the track. The synthetic gravity would shift to simulate different planetary conditions. Each student would race against one another, and the results would be measured based on their ability to adapt to the environment. Zorro had seen the other students take part in this race before, and she knew that even the most agile and strong students had struggled with the extreme conditions. But Jason was different from the moment he stood at the starting line. There was no tension in his posture, no hesitation, as though he already knew exactly what to do. He stood still for a moment before cracking his knuckles, and without any warning he took off with a sudden burst of speed. Zrrk could hardly follow the movement, his body as he sprinted down the track with unnatural agility. He crossed the finish line in a matter of seconds, and Zor's mouth went dry. She had never seen anyone move that fast, not even the Iriths with their powerful legs, or the Yivari with their massive wings. Jason had crossed the track faster than any of them could have imagined. The gym was silent for a moment, and then someone spoke. "Is that even possible?" Calith whispered, their voice trembling. Zrrk could only nod, unable to find the words to describe what she had just witnessed. Jason stood at the finish line, his body still as if the race had been a simple stroll. He glanced over his shoulder at the stunned students and grinned. "That was easy," he said, his voice casual and almost mocking. Zrrk felt her stomach twist with unease. How could anyone move so fast? How could they compete against something like that? They were all trained for years to be the best of the best, and yet here was this human who had effortlessly outclassed them all. Jason turned to face Professor Silar, his expression still calm. "What's next?" he asked, his tone almost disinterested. "Next is strength exercises," Professor Silar replied, recovering from her shock. "You'll lift the weights, and we'll see how much you can handle." Jason nodded and stepped up to the first station. Zrrk could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she watched him prepare to lift the heavy weights. The station was designed for creatures of immense strength to test their limits. It was set up to simulate the weight of various planetary objects, and was calibrated for different species' abilities. Zrrk had seen the other students struggle with these weights, but Jason didn't seem fazed. He approached the first set of weights, which was more than double the size of what a Vorthoid like Zrrk would ever be able to lift without breaking a sweat. He placed his hands on the bar, and with a single motion he lifted it into the air as though it were a toy. Zrrk's eyes widened in shock. The gym was silent again. No one knew how to react. Jason held the weight up effortlessly before lowering it back to the ground. "And is that all?" he asked without breaking a sweat, his voice as casual as if he were asking about the weather. Zrrk's mind raced as she watched him perform the strength exercises with ease, lifting weights that would have crushed her or any of her classmates in an instant. How was it possible? She had heard of Deathworlders before, but she had never imagined one could be so strong. It wasn't just the speed or the strength, it was the way he moved, the way he carried himself. It was as though the laws of physics didn't apply to him. He was a living force of nature, a creature that didn't belong in the Academy, a creature that belonged on a battlefield. Zrrk felt a sense of dread rising within her. She didn't know if she was ready for this kind of competition. She didn't know if anyone was ready for Jason, the Deathworlder, who had arrived and changed everything. Zrrk could hardly believe what had just happened. She had seen the other students struggle with the first exercise. The synthetic track was designed to challenge even the strongest of them, but none of them had ever crossed the finish line so quickly. It was as though Jason had been a blur of motion, a streak of raw power cutting through the air. Zrrk had never seen anything like it. Not in the Academy, not on her home planet, and certainly not in any of the training sessions she had participated in before she floated nervously as the next set of exercises began. Jason stood in the middle of the gym with an almost casual demeanor. It was as though he had just taken a walk through the park and not participated in a race that had defied the laws of nature itself. His eyes scanned the gym as if he were taking in the surroundings with no real concern for what was happening around him. Zrrk felt her heart beat a little faster as she realized that none of them had ever been prepared for something like this. No one had ever trained for the arrival of a Deathworlder, a creature from a planet where survival was not guaranteed, where every day could be a battle for life or death. And yet, here was Jason, showing no fear, no hesitation, no sign of struggle in anything he did. The other students were now looking at him with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Some of them had exchanged nervous glances. Others seemed uncertain whether to continue with the exercises or simply leave and pretend they hadn't seen what had happened. Jason's presence seemed to hang in the air, a weight that no one knew how to carry. Professor Siller was the first to regain her composure. She moved forward and gestured to the next station where weights were set up for strength exercises. "All right," she said with a forced calmness. "Jason, if you would follow me, we'll proceed to the next part of today's session." Jason nodded and followed her without question, his feet making little sound on the floor as he moved. It was almost as though he was gliding. Zrrk felt a twinge of discomfort as she watched him walk. His movements so fluid, so effortless, and so alien. She had never seen anyone walk with such an unnatural grace. But it was. More than that, it was the confidence in his every motion, as though he were accustomed to this kind of power, to this kind of strength. The kind of strength that came from a life lived constantly on the edge of survival. She had seen powerful beings before. The Iriths, with their strength and their wings, the Rivalry with their natural agility, but Jason was different. There was something about him that made Zrrk feel small, something about him that made her question everything she knew about her own abilities. Jason arrived at the next station without hesitation. He looked at the weights with a slight smirk before stepping forward. He bent down and placed his hands on the bar that was nearly 3 times his size. The other students watched in disbelief as he slowly lifted the bar with what seemed to be little more than a thought. He didn't strain against it. His muscles didn't tense. He simply picked it up as though it were the easiest thing in the world. He held it in the air for a moment, his gaze never leaving the other students, and then he set it down with the same ease as if it were a feather instead of a heavy object. Zrrk felt her chest tighten as she watched him. Jason didn't look like he was exerting himself at all. In fact, he didn't even break a sweat. He wasn't even breathing heavily. He was like a machine built for strength and survival, and she could feel the weight of that fact pressing down on her. She glanced at Phoenix standing next to her, his fur bristling in confusion, his eyes wide with disbelief. Calith was shaking their tendrils, vibrating with a mix of fear and awe. Zrrk knew that none of them had ever seen anything like this before. They had trained for years to become the best. But how could they compete with something like this? How could they compete with a Deathworlder? A being that had adapted to conditions so harsh that nothing could challenge him, nothing could stop him, nothing could break him. Jason turned to the professor once again, his eyes glinting with a mischievous gleam. "Is that all?" he asked, his voice low but carrying across the room. Professor Siller blinked as though coming out of a trance and cleared her throat. "No," she said, her voice soft but firm. "There's more." Jason raised an eyebrow as though intrigued. "All right," he said simply. Zrrk could barely hear him now, her mind racing as she tried to process everything she had just seen. She had heard the rumors about Deathworlders, but nothing could have prepared her for this. Nothing could have prepared any of them for the raw power that Jason exuded. He wasn't just fast, he wasn't just strong, he was something else, something more, something that none of them had ever encountered before. Jason looked around the room, his eyes meeting Zrrk's for a brief moment. She felt a chill run down her spine. It was as though he could see right through her, as if he could sense her thoughts, her fears, her doubts. But then he turned his attention to the next set of exercises, and Zrrk tried to shake off the unease that had settled over her. She had to focus. She couldn't let herself be distracted. She couldn't let this strange creature get inside her head. The next exercise was a test of endurance. They would have to complete a series of grueling tasks designed to test their ability to withstand harsh physical challenges. The gym's gravity fields would shift to simulate the harshest of environments, and the students would be forced to push themselves beyond their limits. Zrrk stepped forward with the rest of the class, though her legs felt heavy as she moved toward the obstacle course. She had done this kind of training before. She had been tested on her endurance, her agility, but she knew that today would be different. Today she would be competing against something that no one had ever expected to see in the academy, a Deathworlder. Jason stood silently watching as the other students prepared for the course. He didn't seem to be concerned or nervous in the slightest. He simply stood there, his posture relaxed, and his gaze focused on the instructor, waiting for the next task. Zrrk couldn't help but watch him as she moved to the starting line, her heart thundering in her chest. She had never felt so uncertain before, so out of place. She had always prided herself on her adaptability, on her ability to thrive in any environment, but now she wasn't so sure. She wasn't sure she could compete with him. She wasn't sure she even wanted to try. Professor Solar began the exercise. The gravity fields shifted as the gym transformed into a harsh alien landscape. The temperature dropped sharply. The air became thin as though they were on a distant planet with extreme conditions. Zrrk's legs trembled as she began to move her body, working to adjust to the sudden changes. But as she glanced at Jason, she saw that he had already started the course, his movements fluid and graceful. He seemed unaffected by the harsh environment, as though he were simply walking through a different world entirely. Zrrk gritted her teeth and pushed herself forward, but no matter how fast she moved, no matter how hard she tried, Jason was always just ahead of her. It was as though he had already adapted to the environment before it even changed. It was as though he had become one with it. She could see him darting from one obstacle to the next, with no sign of exertion, as though he were built for this moment. And it made her feel small, it made her feel weak, and for the first time since she had arrived at the academy, Zrrk wondered if she was truly ready for the challenges that lay ahead. Zrrk had never felt so small before in her life. She had spent years training to be the best, to hone her skills, abilities to survive in environments that would kill most of the galaxy's creatures, but none of that mattered now. None of it meant anything as she watched Jason move effortlessly through the harsh environment of the obstacle course. Jason was unlike anything she had ever seen before. It wasn't just that he was fast or strong, it was that he seemed to know the environment instinctively, as though the gravity shifts, the temperature changes, the obstacles themselves were all just minor inconveniences to him. Zrrk could barely keep up. No matter how hard she pushed herself, no matter how much she tried to adapt to the conditions, Jason was always one step ahead, always moving just a little faster, his body twisting and turning with an ease that was beyond anything she had ever witnessed. She had seen some of the galaxy's most powerful species face similar tests, but none of them had ever moved with this kind of grace. This kind of effortless power. She had seen the Rivalry fly with the strength of a storm, but Jason's movements were different. They were deliberate, controlled, as though every action was part of a larger plan, a plan that only he could understand. She stumbled over an obstacle, nearly tripping as the gravity shifted beneath her feet, the synthetic environment testing her balance. She could hear Jason's footsteps behind her. But when she glanced back, he was already halfway through the next section of the course. She felt a sense of frustration rising within her. She had been training for this her entire life, but this human, this Deathworlder, was making her feel like a child, like someone who didn't belong. Zora's webbed feet carried her forward, but every movement felt sluggish, every breath harder than the last. She tried to ignore the weight of Jason's presence behind her, but it was impossible. His every step seemed to echo in her mind, reminding her that she was falling behind. She tried to push harder, tried to force herself through the pain, but her body was starting to protest. The gravity shifts were pulling at her muscles. The cold air was thick with pressure, and her legs were growing heavier with each step. She could hear the sounds of the other students moving behind her, some struggling, some already giving up, but all of them were still in motion, still fighting through the course. Zora felt the sting of exhaustion in her chest, but she kept pushing forward. She had to keep going. She couldn't let herself fall behind, not now, not with all of her friends watching her. Not with Jason so close behind her. She could hear his breathing, now steady and rhythmic, like he wasn't even affected by the environment. She tried to glance back again, but all she saw was him moving past her like a blur, like he was made of something else entirely, like he was born for this moment. Zora's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled through the next section. The air was thin now, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. She could feel the icy chill seeping into her bones. But she refused to stop. She wouldn't give up, not when Jason was so close ahead of her, not when there was still a chance to prove herself. She reached the final obstacle just ahead of her, the last hurdle before the finish line. And she saw Jason, standing there, already waiting for her, his eyes never leaving her, as if he were studying her, watching her every move. She pushed herself forward, one final burst of energy, but it wasn't enough. Jason moved again before she could even reach him, his legs flexing as he cleared the final obstacle in a single bound. Zora watched in stunned silence as Jason landed lightly on the other side of the course. He stood there for a moment, looking back at her and the other students, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that Zora couldn't place, something that made her feel like she had failed. She finally crossed the finish line, panting heavily, her body aching with exhaustion. She felt the weight of her failure settle over her like a heavy blanket. She had done everything she could, but it still wasn't enough. She had pushed herself to her limit, and still Jason had beaten her without even trying. Zora could feel the sting of shame creeping up on her. She had always prided herself on her ability to adapt, on her strength in any environment, but today she had been shown how much she still had to learn, how far she had to go if she ever hoped to stand a chance against someone like Jason. She watched as he turned to face her, his gaze steady but not unkind. "You did good," he said, his voice low and calm. Zora's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected him to say anything at all, much less offer praise. She didn't know how to respond. She had just been completely outclassed by this human, and yet he was offering her words of encouragement. She felt a mixture of confusion and frustration welling up inside her. She wasn't sure how to feel about Jason. She didn't know if she should resent him for making her feel so insignificant, or if she should be grateful for the chance to witness something so incredible. "You're strong," Jason said after a moment, his tone sincere, "but you have to remember something." Zora's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she had to know what he meant. "What do I have to remember?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. Jason's gaze never left her. "Survival isn't about strength alone. It's about adapting to the world around you," he said simply. "You can't just rely on what you've learned. You have to learn to adapt to whatever comes next." Zora felt a strange mix of emotions as she heard his words. She had always believed in the importance of adaptability. It was what had kept her and her people alive for centuries. But hearing it from Jason felt different. It felt like a challenge she hadn't been prepared for. She nodded slowly but didn't say anything. As Jason turned and began to walk away, he moved with the same effortless grace that had defined every moment since his arrival. She watched him for a long time, feeling a sense of awe mixed with frustration. She had never felt so out of her depth before. Jason was a mystery, a creature from a world that seemed impossible to understand, and yet here he was in the academy, pushing them all to be better. Zrrk took a deep breath and forced herself to stand tall. She wasn't going to let this defeat her. She wasn't going to let one person make her question everything she had worked for. She was going to rise above this challenge. She was going to prove that she belonged here, that she could survive alongside the strongest of the strong. Jason might have been a Deathworlder, but she was a Vorthoid, and she was going to adapt just like he had, just like everyone had to do when faced with the unknown. She would find a way to meet the challenge head-on. She would prove herself. Zrrk turned and glanced at her friends. Phoenix was there beside her, his fur still bristling with nervous energy. Khalith was stretching their tendrils as though trying to shake off the tension from the exercise. "You all right?" Phoenix asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. Zrrk nodded, her thoughts still racing. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady. "I'll be fine." She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let Jason the Deathworlder be the end of her. She was going to learn from him, adapt to his world, and make sure she was ready for whatever came next.